show on the road here. So there's record, there's share the screen. Okay, you guys see my screen now? Cool. This is kind of where we left off. Asymmetrical animals have no symmetry. Radially symmetric animals are circular. I was trying to think spherically symmetrical. You know, what's a sphere from yesterday's notes? And I think I finally thought of one. Does anybody want to guess what animal I think is just about a perfect sphere? Anybody want to throw out a guess? Kind of a hard one.
A blowfish.
When they're upset. Yeah, that's a good guess. I was kind of thinking, you know those little spiky deals you step on in the ocean?
Yeah.
A sea urchin. A sea urchin. I was thinking, I don't know like where their mouth is necessarily, but I think those things are almost perfectly circular. I was kind of thinking about that yesterday. Anyways, radial symmetrical is a circle. Bilateral symmetry is like our turtle here. And then again, bilateral symmetry with our fiddler crab, but we went ahead and kind of threw in a twist because he's got 2 different claw sizes. So that was kind of a funny example of that. Angry Beef says turtle soup. Okay, well, you know, you can. Yeah, people have been making turtle soup out of snapping turtles for a long time. Why? Just make sure you cook them all the way. You don't want any medium medium rare reptiles. That's not good. Okay, so anyways, what kind of symmetry we got? Let's talk about our first big type of animal. Our first big type animal we need to talk about are sponges. And so sponges obviously are an invertebrate. They have no spine. Aristotle thought these guys were a plant when he first saw them because they sit and they don't move. So it's pretty easy to come under the assumption that they would be a plant, but they're not. They are an animal. Most of these guys are in salt water, so we're talking about the oceans. There are a few freshwater species. I've never seen any of them. Their phylum names, you guys do not have to memorize phylum names or class names, okay? Don't freak out about those. Those words are awful hard. But basically, they're animals with little pores in them, porifera. And they make their living by being a pump, okay? Because remember, one of the qualifications for being an animal is you had to have some sort of movement. And with sponges, they're staying put their entire life. They're staying still, okay? Except for when they're a little bitty baby swimming to where they're eventually going to land and start growing. Those things are stuck. They're not going anywhere, but they are moving on the inside. There's little flagellated cells that make a current and kind of suck water in through that sponge real slow, and they're catching food that way. So there is still movement. There is still eating, which is very important. And so they are pumping water in through what are called in-current pores, which it makes a lot of sense because like the current of a creek is the water flowing, right? So flowing in is in-current holes, and then X-current is leaving. And most of what you and I see, these guys here, are X-current, right? That's the hole that the stuff is leaving. And so that's what we normally see. Water is kind of flowing out this way. And so that's how they move. That's how they eat. So they are indeed an animal. No brain, no eyeballs, you know, a pretty simple life. Somebody says there's a sponge in my sink. That's fresh water. That's true, Thomas. Some of those sponges, a lot of them are made from actual sponges, like the animal sponge. So that is correct. Good point. And he's fresh water now. I don't know what he was, but he's fresh water now. So that's a sponge. They are a living pump, and that's how they get their food. So let's talk a little bit about their bodies. Their outermost layer of what really makes that sponge kind of hard is called the epidermis. Now, your skin is also called the epidermis, okay? If you've ever, when you were a kiddo, have you ever put like a little safety pin through your skin and it was like clear and it would hang there, but you wouldn't bleed, right? When you took it out, you guys do that? You weren't that weird. I was a weird little kid. I would do that and just hang the little safety pin there, okay? That's your epidermis. If you poke that little safety pin in there and you bled, you'd hit the dermis. Means you went too deep, okay? Epidermis literally means, you know, epi is about or around. So it's what's above the dermis, which is the skin. So epidermis on a sponge is their hard outer layer. And the inside of a sponge is a softer matrix that everything exists in called a mesenchyme, okay? So mes means kind of like middle, and so mesenchyme is this middle layer, And inside the sponge, that's where all of the digestion is going to go on and metabolism and that kind of stuff. Now, here's the weirdest part of a sponge. The weirdest part of a sponge, I guess you should know this first. An amoeba is a little clear cell. It's a protist that crawls through damp soil or water. An amoebocyte is a cell that is part of the sponge but crawls through the sponge's body and pretty much does all the work for the sponge. It is very, very weird. So it's a cell that's like an amoeba, and they move throughout that mesenchyme, and they'll do everything. They move food for the sponge. They move waste for the sponge. They make these little hard structures called spicules, which are like the 2x4s that support the house. You know, they're the structural piece of the sponge. And spicules are these hard minerals that support that sponge. They don't have a skeleton. They don't have bones. They don't have a exoskeleton made of chitin. They have spicules that hold their body up. They can take in ions from the ocean and make them out of different things. Calcium carbonate, if you made spicules out of calcium carbonate, you'd essentially be making this like oyster shells or chalk or, you know, those kinds of things. Others can take silica, which would give you more of a glass type of structure, which is kind of cool. And so it doesn't, don't memorize what they're made out of. That's not that important. Just get the idea that spicules are these hard structures that make up a sponge's body and keep the sponge alive and well supported. And that's kind of the way their body's organized. Any questions over any of that weird stuff? They're weird little animals. All right, so here's a really cool picture that helps us understand this. We got water flowing through this sponge, and the water is drawn in and flows up through this central chamber, and then they capture food with these little cells right here. So I'm actually going to show you a video that'll really help you visualize what's going on. But before I do, does anybody want to make a guess? Make a wild guess here. What do you think a sponge, being an animal, it's got to eat something. What do you think it might eat? Don, give me a guess.
Plankton.
That's a really good guess, Don. Yeah, that's a really good guess. And we got something in the chat box too. Let's see what they threw in there. I can't believe Mr. Stecker knows what I took from his house. I don't, Tanner. I don't have anything valuable worth taking, honestly. As long as I got 3 kids here. So anyways, so at any rate, I'll show you a video of this sponge eating stuff. You're exactly right, by the way, Don. They're eating stuff like bacteria, algae, like one-celled organisms, real small organic stuff. And so that's what I want to show you now. So let me show you this real quick. If I can escape my PowerPoint, I will show you a video. Go away, PowerPoint. Thank you. Okay, so we want this guy.
If the sponge is indeed an animal, it must eat to survive. How does it feed itself when it has no obvious mouth?
A sponge is actually a fantastic pump, which requires an incredible coordination of cells to function. It's a living filtering machine. It lives by sucking in water and filtering out food particles.
These seemingly motionless creatures are working extremely hard in order to feed.
Imagine that to get an ounce of food, a sponge has to pump over a ton of water through itself. Now, can you imagine doing that yourself? Drinking a ton of water to get an ounce of food to your body?
Diaz has studied sponges for decades, yet she has never seen them feed in the wild. Until now, few have. To make the invisible visible, Diaz injects a harmless colored dye into the water near the body of a sponge.
One of the ways we can test for the rate of water flow that moves through the sponge body is to inject a colored dye and measure the speed at which it is pumped through the sponge. Actually, for me, this is the first time I've done this. And and I've been really looking forward to the opportunity for years. And I'm so excited to try this experiment. When I start seeing the color dye coming out of the sponge in less than 2 seconds from when it was applied, I could not believe my eyes. This steady and strong continuous flow of water continuously coming out of the sponge was an incredible realization of the dynamic existence of this organism. It's an incredible sight to witness.
These ghostly exhalations are proof that the sponge is actively pumping. With no mouth, it sucks water directly through its sponge-like body walls, which are shot through with millions of narrow canals and tiny chambers. How does it do it? What secrets hide within the belly of this beast? The best way to find out is to enter one of the many portals into the sponge's secret inner world. Drifting along with countless single...
Okay, just so you know, this video gets a little weird. They're giving you the perspective of if you were a bacterium that were sucked into the sponge in the ocean water, this is like your point of view as you're drawn through the sponge. So it's weird, but you know, it's something.
organisms, we feel the tug of a current. In the wonderland within, this sponge's cells all work for the common good, but they do it in wildly different ways. As the current draws us on, we pass sponge cells that are making new spicules. The walls themselves are treacherous. They can simply engulf their unfortunate prey. As we are drawn through ever narrower passages, the current slows until we burst into one of the sponge's millions of tiny beating hearts. These are colonocytes, cells whose whip-like flagellae powers the pump. The flow quickens again as it whisks us away through the labyrinth of canals that lead out into the sponge's central cavity. What once seemed barely alive is actually a living animal.
Okay. So, all right. Structures we saw in there real quick. Oh, I just threw that into somewhere. I don't even know where it went. That was crazy. Okay, doesn't matter. All right, so here's the deal. This is kind of what we saw, and we're going to break this down into some different structures that you should be familiar with. So, what's the stuff that they're eating? Don made a great guess with plankton, and we're talking about algae, bacteria, organic debris, you know, little single-celled things that these guys can eat and digest. Now, this is what you saw at the end of that video right here, called a choanocyte. If you can't spell that correctly, don't freak out. It's not going to be on your test, but it's pretty cool. The choanocyte has this big old flagellum on it, which you guys are familiar with from the bacteria chapter, and the flagellum is creating a current, and all these flagella are working together to make a current going through that through that sponge. So your little bitty food particles are sucked up in through these in-current pores, and then they're pushed past these choanocytes with the current generated by the sponge. Now you see, as they're getting pushed along, this little collar right here is like a mucus-lined sheath around that flagellum. And this little organic stuff floating along, these little cells floating along here, are going to get stuck in that mucus. And when they get stuck, they're going to be absorbed into the choanocyte. Those are all the little food particles he just caught, you see. And then those are transferred over to the amoebocyte. And the amoebocyte's going to digest that food and move all the particles to where they need to be, just like your small intestine breaks down and moves around the little bitty proteins where you need them to be in your circulatory system, right? This is much simpler than what we're talking about in vertebrates, but it still gets the same job done. So things you should know. You should know that collar cells are containing flagella and that they have mucus all along them to stick the cells to them, and that the flagellum is generating that current going through that sponge. Water comes in through an in-current pore and out through an ex-current pore, nothing too surprising there. And that amoebocytes are basically doing all the work. They don't catch the food, but they digest it and they move it around, and they do just about everything for this sponge. And so that's how a sponge gets its food and pushes fluid through the sponge and all that kind of stuff. Super weird way to get dinner. Any questions about that? Those structures or how the sponge works, anything along those lines? No? Crystal clear? Cool. All right. Well, let me show you something else then. So we've got how they grow, how they get food, how they respond to stimuli. Now we have to talk about sponge reproduction. There's a couple different options sponges have for reproducing. The first is actually asexual reproduction. Some sponges, not all of them, can bud. And budding is when you take part of the parent and you separate that part of the parent out, and it essentially grows into a full-grown sponge. Corals can do this too, and it's really cool because it's like vegetative propagation, right? You take the parts of a root of a plant you want to propagate out and cut them into pieces, and then you grow many of those plants. Corals and sponges, you can do about the same thing, which is neat because you can kind of farm corals and sponges to try to regrow places where coral reefs have been destroyed, right? So you can literally take one healthy coral, bust them up into 20 pieces, keep them in salt water, give it plenty of nutrition. Pretty soon you'll have 20 new coral plants. Go out in a little scuba suit, plant. They start growing up together. It's going to be a few years, but you can start to regrow a coral reef, which is kind of cool. So that asexual reproduction is really something. In the wild, not quite sure what would bust off a chunk of a of a sponge, maybe a boat in shallow water or a sea turtle trying to eat it. I don't know. Then there's gemmules. That's another really cool way for freshwater sponges. If they're looking like the pond's going to dry up or they're about to get into some freezing temperatures, they can form this little bitty cluster of cells that's like surrounded by a spicule coat. And in bad conditions, the parent sponge is going to die, but that little tiny gemmule stays alive, hibernating until conditions are better, and then it will go ahead and hatch out and regrow. So technically, is that reproduction? I don't know. It's asexual reproduction for sure. What did gemmules remind you of from last chapter? Anybody know? They should remind you because bacteria did the same exact trick, the same trick.
Wasn't it with the capsules or something like that?
Close. It was real close. It's called endospores. Endospores. They took their DNA and put it in a bunch of membranes, and then let the parent bacterium die off, and the little endospore was still alive. So the gemmules are a lot like that. And then there's regeneration. So regeneration is, again, like asexual reproduction. You can cut the sponge into little pieces and they'll regrow into an adult. You can do that with flatworms. You can do that with coral. There's lots of different things you can kind of grow that way through regeneration. So that's not necessarily super unique, but it is cool. So asexual reproduction is cool because it's energy efficient and quick, but for genetic diversity, you got to have sexual reproduction, right? Male and female sponges have to undergo sexual reproduction for genetic diversity. This is pretty much going to go on in the spring. And essentially what's going to happen is there's a few different ways this can work, but the sperm from one sponge has to make it to the egg of another sponge. Sometimes this goes to the female sponge in the mesenchyme. The one I'm going to show you in a video here in a minute, it actually happens like in the open ocean, which is crazy and seems like would give you terrible odds. But I guess it works because they're not extinct. Once that happens, they'll make a little flagellated zygote. It looks like a squat little millipede, and that thing flies around as a flagellated larva, cruising along in the ocean until he finds a place to land. Where he lands, he grows up into a new sponge and starts pumping food. And so that looks kind of like this. The adult male sponge releases sperm in the ocean, swims to the female. Amoebocyte takes a sperm to the egg. Out swims a little baby larva. He cruises along in the ocean until he finds a place to land, becomes a young sponge. Cycle repeats itself. So let me show you this one on YouTube. This is kind of crazy one because it looks like the egg and the sperm are both released into the ocean as opposed to the sperm swimming to the female, because it just makes you wonder, how does he find a female sponge in the open ocean with no eyes and no brain? Like that seems like pretty small odds, but I don't know. I guess it works. So let me show you this video. I think you'll enjoy it. If I can get PowerPoint to close. There we go. Okay. The barrel sponge. Maybe. Yes.
We had just an amazing day today. Barrel sponges respond, and it only happens once a year. See the female eggs coming out of the female barrel sponge. Their consistency like bread, like wet bread, just little chunks of eggs coming out just like a volcano. You can see this one barrel sponge. There's a little coney that goes right inside. Watch it. They're not eating the eggs. I didn't see any fish eat them, but it seems he was curious. The male barrel sponge produces the sperm, and it looks identical to like a smoke pot. And the whole reef is smoking like this. The smoke pots. It looks like it's smoldering like a forest fire. For as long as our dive lasted, we swam in the smoky forest of coral. After 4 or 5 years experience this, today's footage was the best as far as clarity of the water, and I was excited to finally get this in 4K. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did making it.
Isn't that just the weirdest thing yet? What a weird, non-specific way to reproduce, like just little white chunks of wet bread, sponge, eggs released into the ocean. Like, good luck, ladies. You know, like that's it. Goodbye. I mean, I guess they don't have a lot of options because it's not like mom's going to go for a walk. You know, she's a sponge. She's stuck. But just crazy to think they just kind of throw them out in the open ocean and hope a sperm finds an egg. It must work, but man, talk about a non-specific way of doing that. That just seems crazy to me. But I guess it works out. So, and then they'll form into a larva, and that larva will swim and plant itself and become a new baby sponge and start growing. So let's talk cnidarians for the next few minutes. We're about out of time here, but cnidarians are pretty much in the salt water only. These are not going to be sponges. These are going to be, let me get my pen here. There we go. In the salt water. We're talking about jellyfish primarily here, but anything that has these little tentacles and then a bell-shaped body, right? And that can be basically a jellyfish is an upside down form of a polyp. Coral is a polyp that's shaped like this, and sea anemones are a much larger polyp that's shaped like this. Jellyfish are the medusa that's flipped around where the tentacles extend down and the body's up above the tentacles. But they both work essentially the same way, which is the tentacles have to capture food, transfer it to one hole, which you could call mouth or anus, and you would be correct either way because food enters the same place waste exits. Maybe not the most glorious design to have there in particular. And that goes into this big cavity called a gastrovascular cavity. Gastro means gut. Vascular means blood supply, like vasculature. And so it basically means where we digest stuff and where we circulate stuff. It all happens in one big tube or one squishy jellyfish body. And so if it is stuck to the ground, that's called a polyp. If it is free floating and swimming around, that's called a medusa. Okay? Sea anemones, they're polyps the whole time. Corals, they're polyps the whole time. Jellyfish start as polyps and then become free swimming medusas, which is kind of weird, but seems to get the job done. And so I want you to know that a polyp is basically the mouth is at the end and they're attached at the bottom of the sea floor. And that's how they're going to make their living. These guys have a mesoglia. It's a lot like the mesenchyme of the sponges that we just talked about. And that's basically their middle body tissues, essentially, where all the food they digest is going to go and where waste is generated. Epidermis is the same here. We're still going to have that same term for the skin. And then you guys are familiar with what tentacles are because, you know, you're familiar with what tentacles are. So that's not a surprise, I guess, there. So any questions about any of these things? Cnidarian structures, body structures, any of that kind of stuff? No? Have any of you guys seen jellyfish before? My South Dakotans? One person's got a head nod of jellyfish. Okay. Wait, 2 people have seen jellyfish. That's not bad for South Dakota. Okay, cool. Did you touch them? Did they sting you? No.
It was dead on the
It was
beach.
dead on the
Yeah.
beach.
Yeah, there was like 20 of them though.
That's pretty cool.
There's
Pretty
a
cool.
tank in Sioux Falls with them.
A tank in Sioux Falls with jellyfish. Very cool. You guys know there's a jellyfish that we think is immortal. Every time it freaks out, it becomes like a little embryonic jellyfish again. And anytime it's disturbed, it becomes a baby. So we don't know how old it is. They could potentially live forever. I'll show you those guys next time. They're pretty funny. So anyways, no questions for me. Going once, going twice. Throw in the chat box if you have a question. Okay, we're going to meet tomorrow, same time. It might not be a bad time to print the Hydra labeling worksheet. I'll put that on tomorrow's post right away in the morning. If you've gone and printed those worksheets out of that folder already, great. If not, there's one called Hydra, and there's like 4 blanks on it. It's real easy, but that'd be a good time to have that tomorrow. So go ahead and print that Hydra worksheet, or even just have it on your computer and type in the answers. I don't care. You pick, but just a real simple, here's the epidermis, here's the mesoglia, here's the gastrovascular cavity kind of thing. And we'll watch that eat some water fleas and stuff. It'll be kind of cool. So, all right, cool. Last chance for questions on anything before we log off. Going once, going twice. 3 times sold. All right, cool. You guys have a good afternoon, and I'll see you tomorrow at 2. All right. Bye, everybody.